So, you're Jad.
I'm Jad.
Oh, I've seen you around. So, Jad, tell me, how'd you get here?
So, initially it was a conversation, and then a text message, and then it was a meeting and a car ride, and here we are. So, I think it was pretty quick.
Yeah, pretty solid breakdown. Where'd you come here from?
I'm visiting Halifax from British Columbia right now. I was living in Halifax for a while, studying at Dalhousie, and then taking a period of time to work on a couple of personal projects, and then I'll be back to finish up my education and hopefully start my life as a functioning member of society.
A functioning member of society.
Yeah. I don't know who defines that, but
Huh.
I've heard that my job isn't real.
Your job isn't real? My profs keep telling me that we're educated for positions that aren't existing yet.
That sounds about right. You see, my degree, I'm educated for a position that is being phased out. So
Really?
that's the fun part. So we got to get a little bit more creative.
That's interesting. So we're on the opposite spectrum here. So what are you studying here?
I'm studying entrepreneurial management, but in reality, the courses that we're learning aren't exactly teaching us how to manage. It's teaching us a series of information, but not problem solving. And that's why more often than not, engineers and scientists who are more pragmatic and are through their education have to learn problem solving skills are taking up these positions. So not super confident about my education at this very point in time, but I'm learning something somehow.
That's funny that you put problem solving over everything else, because I think it is a very crucial point, because we have such an abundance of information right now that memorizing it seems a little futile. Yeah, I don't see how a lot of biology classes are like, history especially. It's definitely like interesting to know, but memorize everything word for word seems a little useless nowadays.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at coding, for example. The reality is, like, yeah, you can learn it and you study it for extended periods of time. But when you come to practice, even the best coders are Googling everything anyway. You're not actually just like regurgitating every bit of code and every solution to every bug right out of your brain. Like, no, you get an error, you Google what the error is, and you know how to solve it. That's just basically what it is. I mean, I'm simplifying it big time.
No, I can confirm it 100%.
Right? So even in the most, like, the positions that are like I have the highest demand, the problems are solved at a simple Google search. I'd hope to God that my doctor doesn't have to Google my symptoms and find out what's wrong with me, because that would be scary. But
it wouldn't though. But you see, with a doctor, even if they're super trained, let's say super smart, they only have a limited amount of experience because they're human, right? They could have only seen like 1,000 patients in their lifetime. But with a medical-oriented AI, they could have seen those 1,000 patients like a second ago. Like, you see, they have much bigger pool of patients. They would be studied, so they would have been learned on like millions of different cases. So, and if they learn from that properly, they have much bigger pool to pull a decision out of. So that's something about medical professions in my opinion.
That's interesting. I would wonder though if the experience of the patient wouldn't deter, like AI and getting involved in the medical profession. I could totally see that being an issue. It's like, okay, if there's what's interesting with like the human experience is that there's an element of doubt, right? If a doctor has doubt, then it's like, okay, I recognize that I could be wrong, right? And before making a decision, the possibility of being wrong is being functioned, like added to that function, the process. And I wonder if AI would have that, if it makes a decision and it's programmed to make that decision in this set of circumstances. If there's no like, okay, it fills these criteria, and if a situation arises that doesn't totally fit, is different but fits all this criteria, that element of doubt is not there, and the decision is made without processing the new information because it wasn't in the programming.
Yeah, absolutely. It also has to do with how much patients are willing to disclose. So if they could be talking about some symptoms, but missing out, even unintentionally, the most important ones. And if AI doesn't pick up on that, it's like missing the biggest chunk of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
While doctors, could know from experience that patients keep those things for themselves if they're a little private, or discomforting. So yeah, definitely something. What a great time to be alive.
Honestly.
Although, have you seen surgeries done by robots?
Yeah, like the high precision. I've seen videos of them, but I haven't really looked much into those. But it'd be kind of cool. That makes more sense to me, where it's like a very specific task, and that solves that specific task that removes the human error out of. And I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking out of pocket, but I feel like that's in that aspect. Having AI, a specified machine to replace human error, feels a lot safer.
It does, doesn't it? I think where a lot of this is going, at least where it will be for its earlier stages of development, is very efficient human-computer interaction. So you would get, for example, this robotic arm that does a surgery, but the surgeon is still present there, and like it leads it towards where it needs to be and what procedures it should do. Because so far we're still very far from getting a functioning AI. Well, functioning AI similar to human consciousness. We can get a very specific AIs to do very specific things, but it still does not have critical thinking like most humans do. So it's going there, it's getting there. Let's hope it'll get there eventually, so humans won't be able to won't have to do all those stressful jobs and very heavy jobs.
Yeah, look forward to see it.
Scheduling for doctors, it's tough. Like you could be working 12 hours or 12 hours a day, 12 days in a row.
It's nuts. And then what I've learned as well, I have a few family friends that are nurses, like long-term nurses, and the relationship between the doctor and patient is so limited because of the amount of workload or the amount of wait lists on specific doctors.
Yeah.
And so the amount of time that it takes for a doctor to make a decision is pressured by the amount of time that they have in the day and the patients and the urgency. So a lot of the time the nurses are actually just doing the checkups themselves, and the doctor has to trust in because they're more intimately knowledgeable about the patient. And in those situations, it's like the doctor can come to a conclusion because the information that they have is limited when the nurses are there more often. And that doesn't seem right. Like, first of all, because the nurses aren't getting paid nearly as much as the doctor is, and somehow they understand the patients better and they would make better decisions. But the fact that the doctors are so pressured by time and work that they're making decisions off not enough information, and these are life and death situations that they have to just like pump out. It seems kind of ridiculous, right?
No, it definitely does. So maybe like introduction of AI would help fix that doctor shortage, because that kind of comes out of a shortage of doctors, because there's not enough doctors to see all the patients basically.
It would be interesting to see some sort of system where there's a comprehensive AI checking, like physical checkup system, and then it delivers all the information and then compiles all the information, the symptoms and tests or whatever, and then gives that information to the doctor, a comprehensive checkup, and that way it cuts back on the time that the doctors need to complete their checkups. Therefore, they can make informed decisions and save the time in the process, therefore releasing the pressure of nurses who might not have the proper training to make those decisions, to not have to worry about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like sort of incorporate the human element with the specific scientific knowledge.
Yeah, that's a very that would be pretty useful. Oh well, speaking of more realistic things, what jobs do we have now? Where have you worked lately?
So it's been in the last year I've worked a series of very different jobs. I went from student union executive to tree planter to trailer renovator and flipper, I guess, to a bartender and content creator. So I've had quite a few jobs in the last while, but I feel like they all sort of fell into position one after the other, and it flowed really well. But it's definitely been an interesting challenged to juggle certain passions and work and necessities, right?
I see. What would you say you like the most?
About just that whole experience.
Yeah, out of those things you did.
I think the ability to adapt to every different situation. So despite whatever situation I was in, I was able to quickly learn and fit into the situation, because each of those jobs or physical locations for those jobs was so drastically different. I could be working in the bush, remote, no power, no water, no heat, just sort of very simple living, cooking off a propane stove, like washing my hands in rainwater, drinking rainwater as a sustenance, to staying in like nice hotels or nice places in rich neighborhoods and high rises, and being able to relate and associate with people on either side of the socioeconomic spectrum, or in different backgrounds, different cultures, different living standards, and just walking out of that being able to, hey, I can get where I need to go, I can do what I need to do despite whatever situation I'm in, and that's found a very empowering experience.
Yeah, it definitely feels almost comforting knowing that you'll be fine, disregarding the scenario, that you can, survive out of basic minimum.
It's the self-sustainability. It's, like the kind of things like we always talked about as kids. It's like, oh, if the zombie apocalypse happened right now, yes. How long do you think you'd last?
I still have a Mirage at home for that case.
I do too. As a awesome survival kit type thing.
Hey man, gotta be prepared.
You never know what's gonna happen.
Never know. You know what? Having food at home was pretty comforting when everything went into lockdown.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know I have like proper meals ready to eat. Not just ramen noodles like a lot of people.
Hey, you can go a long way with ramen noodles. You just gotta know what to add to them.
You can make it fancy. You can put like a boiled egg in there.
Ooh,
or
yeah.
Fry up some sausage or like some ham.
That's what I do. What I've learned recently is you take the flavor packs. So you boil the noodles as you would, but before you put the flavor packs, you take the flavor packs, put some oil, probably like sesame seed oil, put the flavor pack, some minced garlic, and some soy sauce. Stir it up until like fries. Get the garlic to a golden brown.
Interesting
texture, and then becomes this little paste. Drain the water off the noodles, and just like kind of like stir the noodles in the paste, and becomes this way richer flavor. Without being diluted by the water.
Yeah, it's very smart. I prefer to get my water out first before I add flavor as well. You see, we're speaking of high cuisine now.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely though, and oil is a good addition.
Yeah, it's the garlic that gets me a little like crispy, like a little bite of it. It's like,
but do you like fry your garlic first?
Yeah. So you like kind of like saute the garlic, then you add the sauce, the flavor packs, and the soy sauce, and then it just mixes really well.
Oh, making me hungry, Web.
Yeah, actually, me too.
Speaking of, you mentioned you were planting trees there. How did that go? How long did you do that for?
So typical seasons start mid to late April, and the longest they'll go is early to mid August. The season's usually broken down into spring and summer, as like the sort of like industry standard is like in the spring you plant certain types of trees, certain size. So usually trees that are frozen and then kept into like hibernation for the winter, and then you take the seedling, which is like a tree's about like this big and has like this much soil, and a small tree, and the soil is usually frozen for the spring trees, and then by the time it's summertime they would have thawed out, and so it's a different shape, different size. Especially since those trees, if you were to take a warm tree, a summer tree, and plant it in the spring, mid to late April, when the ground is still cold, it sort of freezes the soil. And so you want a sort of hibernated tree in the cold ground. And then by summer, they'll thaw out and start to get acclimatized to their environment.
Interesting.
And when it's summer, you plant summer trees. So the plugs, the soil portion of the tree is much smaller for summer trees. And it's usually a lot easier as well.
Very specific. You see, I didn't even think it was that that specific for different seasons.
Well, that's what's interesting. the Canadian, specifically in BC, different provinces operate on different like protocols, but the Canada is one of the best, some of the best sustainable practices for reforestation. Still not the best, not as it should be at the very least. But we do take a lot of, let's say, production hits to make sure that we're not planting monocultures, we're not planting like bad trees, for example, trees that are just going to die anyway. But it's still like the whole industry is profit based, and so there will always be situations, no matter what, that you're bypassing the health of the environment to plant the most trees to make the most profit.
So all of those trees that you are planting, were they specifically, planted there for future lumber?
Depends. So there's some contracts where you're hired by a reserve or a private owner, and so we do quite a bit of burn reforestation. So it's like if a wildfire sweeps through an area, a farmer or let's say they have like a horse ranch or something like that. They want to replant their forests and their environments for the trails and whatever. Then they'd hire companies like the one I worked for, and they would plant that whole area for a private company. Most other companies, though, especially the more northern BC you go, is all for reforestation. It's a lot less often in that industry that is for just environmental care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I see. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
How about, cutting down less trees? So you have to replant less trees.
There's a certain percentage that the forestry association, I don't forget what it's called, has allotted for the industry to cut down, right? So they'll set off a specific amount of land. It'll be 3 to 4% of the sort of the province's actual forests, and so BC is a huge province, and 3% is 3-4% is an obscene amount of wood, right?
Yeah.
So it's still a lot, and this is you can't cut more than this, and unfortunately, the industry is in such high demand. The reality is, Canada's number one natural resource is wood. That's what we have. We have 80% of the population lives on the bottom 100 kilometers.
Even less than that, I'd say. But
yeah, it's the entire country is just forests, and that's our number one resource. And so they've been taking advantage of that a lot, and it's just the most we export a ton, and it's kind of things are you gonna really stop Canada's number one resource, a business?
Yeah.
And so the conversation of stop making money is difficult to have with people whose entire industry for generations, their lives for generations, are depending on this industry.
Yeah, you see, definitely a generational thing. So back in the day it was completely fine, but now we're struggling with people who've been doing it for so long, so there's just nothing else for them to do if this stops.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely quite a chunk of profits. But what would be alternative to that? So what is all of that lumber is used for?
So it depends on the wood. So certain trees and species would be used for pine, for example. You can use that for building lumber, for reconstruction. You use certain the portions of the wood for pulp, for paper, for toilet paper. You'll see wood being used for everything, whether from furniture to whatever. So it depends on certain species or have a better wood for certain activities or certain products. So it's tough to know exactly what is used, and especially if it's being exported. But there's a lot of use. Every house you see needs wood, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely does. Unless it doesn't. What about mycelium bricks? Have you heard of those?
I've not.
So basically it's mushroom-based structure,
Mm-hmm.
and you plant mushrooms in the form of bricks. So their roots, if you can call them that, make up the brick, and it just solidifies with other chemicals, of course. But the idea is that you can make a pretty sturdy structure out of a fungus
Mm-hmm.
and use that as a construction material.
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a few alternative methods. There's hemp, still pretty expensive, but hemp is so easy to grow. People use bamboo. People have used a number of different alternatives. I think what it is just the industry is so large that the process of switching to a different resource is, it's one of those things, like it's like oil or gas, right? It's the market's so big that there's so much like relying on that method, and like the building, like I'd say if you're building a house and you have no experience using mycelium bricks, the average person is going to take the time to learn mycelium, how to build with mycelium. They're just going to keep using wood because that's what they know, that's what they trust. But again, that we said the same thing about like battery powered vehicles,
Yeah.
like electric vehicles. We thought it was like, oh, it's unreliable, no one's going to want that, and that's changed. As long as if it's cheaper and nicer and better quality, why wouldn't a person choose that? But more often than not, lumber seems to be more affordable because it's had such a ready supply. Having, let's say, the hemp, I think it's something to build per square meter. It's something like $130 per square meters, right? And with wood, it's a fraction of that. So if you're building something, of course you're not going to pick hemp bricks. Or like hemp materials. You're going to pick wood.
Yeah.
Right. And I would love to see that switch, but it would have to be a consumer decision more than anything.
It does definitely bottleneck into the consumer preferences. So if everyone wanted to, benefit the society, and like everyone realized how deep we are into climate change, everyone would stop using cars like instantly. But that's definitely a personal decision, and a lot of people, rely on it, as they rely on a lot of resources. And that's, quite frankly, one of the only options for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is quite scary to see the forestry industry just disregard the natural well-being of these like remote regions.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's been one of the largest cases of civil unrest, civil disobedience in Canadian history is happening right now on Vancouver Island, and regarding to the cutting down, the logging of old growth trees. Old growth specifically being trees that are, I think the term is like 300 to 400 years old, and these massive grandfather sort of trees, right? And you think it's like, okay, it's just another tree, but understanding that in these like communities, in these natural habitats, there's a matriarchy within the culture of the trees. So as the tree grows and experiences, let's say, a certain bug or a certain weather type or a certain pattern, right? It'll experience that, and then once it learns, it will react in a certain way to protect itself, and that experience travels through the roots of the trees around it, right? So as trees die due to a certain natural circumstance, let's say it's a certain bug. Okay, so the old trees have been through that bug. They learn to release a certain chemical that repelled that bug. And as new trees grow, it will teach that information to the trees around it, the younger trees, so that they will grow with that knowledge. And so if those bugs ever attack those younger trees, they grow. They can repel them. So there's a literal communication system through the roots that we never thought was possible when the logging practices began. It was just that tree is equal to this tree, and it doesn't matter. You cut down this one, you can plant another one, and it doesn't make any difference.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, every tree is equal to one tree. It doesn't matter what the tree is. And so if you're going to say, I'm going to cut down 5 trees, why don't I make it the biggest 5 trees? And those trees tend to be those matriarchal grandparent trees, and the ones that are teaching and giving nutrients to all the trees around them. So you cut that down, right? You take that, you get yeah, it's one tree, but it's worth like 5, right? Small ones. And all of a sudden, the entire ecosystem is taking a huge hit. Because as the tree grows, the largest one creates the sort of protective canopy over the rest of the trees. So even the weather and now is something that the rest of the trees have to worry about, right? That's how they grow. And there's been huge unrest going on within the forestry industry because of that practice. And it's a simple thing like, don't cut up the old ones. Stick to your land, the land that you've been using to reforest. If those trees aren't as good, that's because you raised them wrong. Your planting practices the last 40 years have been detrimental to the growth of those areas. And so you have these spindly little trees planted in rows of the same type of tree. And those trees come out like awful and useless. That's what you get, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like it's been like all the trees that we're reaping now from like decades ago from the bad practices are bad trees. And so they have to resort to cutting down like what you'd call like first growth, like the original trees of that area. And when they plant, yes, the practices have gotten a lot better, but we're not going to be able to reap those trees for another 30, 40 years. So for the next 30, 40 years, instead of cutting down the trees that were grown specifically for reforestation, they're resorting to cutting down the old trees. And that's where the problem arises. So it's one of those things like, okay, so if we're going to continue with that practice, like the necessities there, that's how we build our houses, our economy runs off that. It's a huge industry for Canadians. Like you can't deny that. Then there needs to be a sort of resolve on like, where do you draw the line on what parts of our climate, what parts of our world can you not destroy for per profitable gain? And we've been pretty clear, not we, but like many people, that it should be drawn at old growth. You know, like these trees that are a living community, just leave those ones to be. There's only like 3% left in BC. You know, like these are trees are going endangered. These are first growth, and it's become an argument of not just spirituality. Like these are connected and these matriarchal figures in its purest form, but they're also like historical monuments. Like you look at the sequoia trees or the redwood trees in the States, they have like reserved them off. It's like the government has intervened. It's like, no, these are beautiful. We acknowledge that. They're rare, they're old, they're huge, and they're monuments to like nature doing its thing. But we don't see that as much in Canada. Like, it's very rare to have like reserves specifically for trees. And it's the logging industry is so powerful in provinces like BC, where even the political leaders, you'll see like Horgan is the premier in BC. He's been advertising sustainable forestry for a long time, and promising that we're going to change it, and then putting out ads and lobbying and saying all this stuff that he's going to do that. And then as they're logging the old growth trees in Fairy Creek, Vancouver Island, he's on TV saying that no trees are being logged. Mm-hmm. It's like,
how credible is that?
There's like, how credible is like that lie being on TV? Or
yeah,
I mean, it's literally an online interview, time stamped to it would have been in November of 2021, and at the same time I was there in Fairy Creek seeing the loggers on the mountain chopping down trees. So it was like, no logging is happening in Fairy Creek. I'm like, I don't know, man. I'm looking at it right there. So there's clearly some sort of background, like backdoor sort of conversation that's being happening that prevents the provincial government from sort of cutting that line on the profits, right? So now it's not just about the consumer, not just about the community. Now it's gone political. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where it narrows down to in a lot of cases. Just politicians being lobbied by people who need money from those industries.
Absolutely. And it's like, it's also, it's very difficult, and this is definitely something that both sides are refusing to sit down and have a conversation about, is what do you exactly describe as old growth? Where do you draw the line, right? Certain people describe old growth as a certain size or a certain age or a certain species, right? Or a certain area or a zone. So the fact that is not fully defined makes it a lot more difficult for lawmakers to to isolate that that type of tree. And then it's like, okay, if old growth aren't supposed to be cut down, we'll leave the old growth, but old growth are there to protect the entire environment around it. So just because you save the old growth doesn't mean the younger trees, the third or fourth generation trees that are growing around it, are benefiting from the old growth. Can you cut those down? And you'll see examples of that happening also in Vancouver Island in the Lonely Doug. It's a massive old growth tree that was being boycotted by forest defenders for a long period of time. They stayed on, they chained themselves to the tree, refused to come down, so they logged everything around it and left that one old growth tree. And you'll see photos of it. It's called the Lonely Doug, and it's just a solo tree all on its own. Its entire utility, its value to its community is now at question because its community is gone, right? So like, are we just protecting the old growth, or are we protecting all the land around it? And it's a big question, because how much land are we protecting? And that's a lot of money that the industry is not getting, right? And so those specific definitions are being lost, and so that the industry itself is complicit to this this sort of like genocidal attack on old growth trees, as an extreme term of words, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty heavy. Oh wow. What would be, a workaround for that? Like, what is the most sustainable forestry technique we know so far?
Well, we're moving in the right direction. I think for example, in BC versus Ontario, we see a lot of practices that are more sustainable in BC. For example, in Ontario, they plant monoculture in straight lines, which means they just do one tree species. They plow trenches in rows, and you take the trees, you plant them in a row at a certain distance apart, mm-hmm. and it's just rows on rows and rows and rows of trees. To some degree, it works because, let's say you're planting spruce, you plant spruce at the bottom of the trench, and because spruce likes less sunlight, more damp, low areas, and you plant pine at the top of the trench. So trench would just be like a dip in the ground, right? So you plant the pine at the top, spruce at the bottom. And so in that sense, okay, you give them, you manipulate the environment to suit the plants growing. But if it's just that species, it's gonna be destructive to the environment. That's not gonna grow healthy. There needs to be diversity. There needs to be like old and young trees working together. It needs to be like, that's not a healthy way of doing it. We've done it for decades, and while the trees are better now, the samplings are stronger, like they've been specifically chosen for their genes. Yes, that's better, the more guarantee of the growth, mm-hmm. But it's not good for the culture. BC, we do a little bit better. There's a lot of organizations are more specific with how they want the trees planted. For example, you could see specifications like plant on the east side of an object, an obstacle like a fallen log, a tree, a big rock, so that the trees get the least amount of sun so they don't dry up and die. And you plant, again, in certain trees in certain areas. You make sure that every tree is planted in an area that gets, you don't plant it in brush if there's anything like drip lined. So it's like if there's anything above it, you don't plant there. A lot of like contracts could be something like protect the naturals. So if you're planting and then you see a naturally growing tree, you give it space, you let it grow so it can grow, and you plant somewhere else. So you treat naturals, like naturally growing saplings, as the ones you've planted, and you kind of treat them as like on their own. So you can, that one's a little bit more difficult because then you end up just like, the contracts get a little bit more difficult on that one, but you're allowing the natural order of things to occur, but you're supporting it. You're bolstering up the natural process, which is a little bit more gentle. But there isn't really the guidelines on that are very much, hey, this is my land, this is the contract that I want. Okay. Most of them are like, we want to plant to ensure the most growth, rather than the healthiest outcome for the environment. That said, there is a lot of conversations that could be had, in my opinion, and by all means, it's not expert opinion, but on like kind of drawing the line. You know, this is the land that we can use for reforestation, and then you can use that land as whatever, however you like. But the trees that are like first generation trees or second generation trees, the ones that do have that culture that that are protected, like we choose, like these are the kind of trees that are old growth. These are the kind of trees that we choose as a society to keep for our children to see, as trees that have been here for long before we were born, and will be here long after we're dead, right? And it's kind of this, like, the bigger the tree, the bigger the conqueror. You see that you fell the biggest tree. It's like, yeah, like, man, we're taking big shit because we're cutting down big trees and we're conquered the earth. But the earth is going to be there long after us. So why are we rushing this process? You know, let's give it the respect and leave certain areas as a compromise to nature, right? That would be my personal opinion. And there's so much that isn't like vague. That's such a vague statement, but the industry is like, so many people are dependent on an industry, but we're all dependent on the environment, right? So we can't stop the industry entirely, but it would be much better if we could have some sort of compromise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess definitely something to look into for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And even starting now, I don't know, lumber, you say it's the most efficient way for building houses, right?
It's the quickest.
The quickest and the cheapest.
It's cheap, depending on, of course, on the structure. Like a residential house, lumber is just the easiest, and there's the most information about how to build with lumber. You can still build with cement as like the most like stable. I think cement actually might be a little cheaper. I'm not sure, to be honest. But it's the most common practice, right? Especially for speed. Like it's a lot quicker to build a house with wood than to pour the concrete foundation and then just build it up with wood, build the framing, and then just do your thing, than to pour out an entire like concrete structure. So in that case, you could argue that the more sustainable option is wood, because you can regrow wood. You can't regrow cement. Once it takes form, it's done. You know, it's like, that's a unnatural process. If you want to argue that, that's a fair argument to make. But it's definitely not the most, there's better arguments making that.
What is the best for now?
Compromise. I think there's a lot of like emotional arguments on either side of the spectrum, like, and it's like understanding that those arguments are legit. Like, those are conscious people that are going to be negatively impacted by this experience. The logging industry is huge. Hundreds and thousands of people depend on this industry, right? And it's crucial for our economy to maintain. To some, not crucial, maybe, but it's important. It's a very valuable asset to our economy, especially in a time like this when so many other industries are not being supported at all. And forestry is one of those industries that it's much easier to maintain despite the pandemic, because you're so isolated, right? But also recognizing that there's also the conscious sort of realization of like, you're cutting down a naturally produced space for an artificial one that's not going to be the same, right? The trees aren't going to grow as big. They're not going to grow as healthy. Like, there's certain species that they'll use solely for a seed dispersion. So it'll be like they're like mother trees, basically. So their only purpose is to grow and distribute seeds that will be the true repopulation of so it's not like specifically planted. So there's a lot of strategies for that. But I think it's just a lot of the conflict that arises is coming from a complete discreditation of like the other party. You'll see forest defenders or activists or environmentalists that completely discredit the use of trees, and because it's like, I don't cut down 10,000 trees, I don't do that.
Yeah.
But in reality, they need wood to build their homes. They need wood to build to get from point A to point B. That's part of the economy that they're involved in, and like the recognition that you can't separate yourself from the system that you're trying to fight. And it's very difficult to remove yourself from that system, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. It's same people who tweet about, slave labor from iPhones.
Exactly. So it's a very difficult leg to stand on. And it's like, if you're gonna boycott it all, that's like the harm that's done by not having the resources to house people is also damaging. So my point is, it's a complex issue, and it requires a lot of people sitting down and talking and treating each other as human beings. Because I've seen a lot of animosity between the parties that has led to no good experience.
No. Yeah. So what do you say to people just gathering around and open conversation disregarding money? Everyone sits around the table, all the politicians, lobbyists, major lumber companies, and they just talk about, okay, so money, let's not talk about it. We have this system, we have to contain it. If we don't do anything right now, what would happen to it? If no one loses anything, no one gains anything, we just keep it like this. How's it gonna go? Is it gonna die out? Is it gonna recover? If it's gonna recover, how long is it gonna take? And just go from there. So
like if you were to sit down and completely disregard, if like the industry completely stopped, how would society get impacted? Is that what you're saying?
Well, more like how nature would get impacted, and how like those tree populations regrow. And okay, do we need to interfere right now? If not, okay, they're on their way to being sustainable. How can we work from that sustainable infrastructure to get as little resources as possible, while still keeping our profit margins, passable, just barely passable?
There has been a conversation around that as well. So that 3 to 4% that I mentioned earlier is a specific sort of number based on the entire population. So the entire like resources. Okay, they've tallied up all the lumber that they have available to them, and let's say it needs to be a certain age to reach sort of logging a bit long, like being even worth to log, right? So let's say it's 25 years. I'm making up a number right now. 25 years. So of all the trees that are happening, let's say you cut down 3 to 4% of the loggable trees by the time the next season happens, because they usually log only in the summer, or the majority in the summer. Then how much would have reached that sort of age next year, because more trees will grow. I think in those conversations, there's a lot of science that is misunderstood or misrepresented in these decisions that are being made. So one of the claims or the sort of decisions that have been made in the recent history has been sort of ensuring that the amount being logged is less than the amount that's being grown, right? So that's I think is a great start.
It is.
So those conversations are happening, and there's a lot of really good work done by like universities like University of British Columbia, especially in northern BC. It's a huge industry where there's research done on how what kind of situations, what kind of help the tree grow and repopulate healthily. So there is a lot of science that needs to be had, that needs to be like considered in those spaces. So I don't think it would be a conversation like specifically among business leaders or politicians. It needs to include the activists and the scientists as well. in the grand scheme of things, in the reality, you cannot have that conversation without the money being involved, right? The amount that the it's like the BC, like, let's say BC government, it makes money off taxes, right? And if that industry takes a hit, the entire operating budget would take a hit, right? Yeah. So it's kind of like jeopardizing its wealth by if you jeopardize the industry itself. So even the politicians have some sort of like horse in this race, because if they don't have the same budget, then they can't produce as much, right? They can't do the things that they want to do.
Yeah, for sure. So just not a solution, but maybe a step towards finding an alternative could be finding something or making something to substitute that industry.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a look at countries like Japan, for instance,
mm-hmm.
that don't have a lot of natural resources, they're still doing pretty good. They're just doing, different tasks. And to minimize the impact on those specific West Coast cultures of trees, could distribute lumbering, all over the world. Like, it has a little bit of forests.
Mm-hmm.
We could say so. It has some wood there. So instead of, just chopping down one part of this continent, could distribute it a bit more efficiently around
Mm-hmm.
the other parts, and just focus on something less environmentally detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
And, do that.
Yeah, the one thing that you'll notice as well in those processes, I think the biggest issue with forestation is the reforestation process, right? I think the industry has taken such a huge hit in the past because the back in the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s, the process in which they reforested was so poor and just sort of like, let's get this done easy and quick, that those trees are useless now. Those areas are useless. Those entire cultures are useless. So the difficulty in sort of like releasing sort of responsibility to different nations is that there is no global like rule book for how to reforest. What's the most sustainable way to reforest, to replant? And the reality is Canada is one of the best in the world. Like, we have some of the best sustainable practices for reforestation, and it's still not working.
Yeah.
Right? And so relying on another country to get trees that they might have offers a problem. Are we diverting our issue to some other country that can get away with lesser...
Exactly. That's a very fair point.
Lesser like bylaws and regulations. Like, you'll see sort of like the same thing with Canadian garbage. All our garbage is just passed on to another country that has lesser problems. And so, like, yeah, we're sustainable, we're clean, we're eco-friendly. It's because some other country's taking all our garbage, all our dirt.
Yeah.
Right? So I think the solution would have to come from inside the party, inside the farm, right? Like, it needs to come to recognition of the true politicians being honest and transparent with the activities that are happening, like seeing the inconsistencies of like the statements made by politicians around improper logging practices, and then the support of the logging, the improper logging practices by the Canadian government. Millions and millions of dollars have been spent in enforcing logging, improper logging practices on the sole basis of profit. Like, there's land that, especially within those like protests that are happening, there's land that it wasn't the Canadian government's place to sell to private companies. It wasn't their place in the land in the first place to just be like, okay, we're just going to give up this land. You see that fight in Wet'suwet'en with the pipelines. You see that fight in Fairy Creek, all over the country. Every forestry or like development that's happening that's profit-based is often a government-supported initiative for profit. Like, that land had to go from someone to someone for that private company to make that that decision. Like the oil and gas, like that forget the name of the company. It'll come back to me. But that pipeline, to have that much land on that specific line, it had to come from somewhere. Not a single person would have owned that. Like, all that had to come from government support, obviously. Right? So if the government is making decisions on private land, that it has no place to make those decisions. And often not, it ends up being an indigenous problem, because there's very few people live in those areas except for those indigenous people. Those are those only people who recognize that space as what it was, right? And then once you involve the indigenous struggle into like the land usage, then it becomes a whole other. It's a very complicated problem.
It is a complex issue. It's terrible that people who care the most about the environment are the ones getting oppressed because of it.
And the people who have the least options, you know.
Yeah,
it's tough because we don't notice it. We're not living out in the areas that are being logged. We're not living in those areas that are being transformed to fit a pipeline. So we don't literally see the damage that's being done. We just see the benefits.
Yeah. I think this is a pretty dark but an important note to focus on and maybe finish for tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Damn, well, pleasure talking to you.
Yeah.
Definitely bringing up some important points. Something to think about for everyone.
Absolutely.
How we are involved in this. What part are we doing to stop it? Or at least improve?
Yeah. Absolutely. It's the conversations around climate, around proper utilization of our natural resources are difficult conversations to have. It's the dark truths. It's lies. It's lobbying. But the conversations that need to be had, it's realities that we need to consider. Because if we don't consider them, then we're living in that lie, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully those conversations spark interest, and you can look into the Fairy Creek protests, look into the Wet'suwet'en pipeline protests, and recognizing that the indigenous communities are the first communities that get harmed in those situations. And then when those communities are no longer putting up the fight, who's putting up the fight, right? It has to be the everyday person. It has to be you. It has to be me. It has to be the person, your neighbor, right? Because then all this stuff is happening and we don't even notice it. Before we know it, everywhere outside of our cities is desolate, right?
Yeah.
So conversations we have are difficult, but those difficult conversations are often the best.
Those are definitely the ones we need to have. We need to have them. We need to talk about this.
Absolutely. I'm glad we had this conversation.
I'm very glad as well. Speaking of your further talking, do you have anything coming up for yourself? Any podcast-related behavior?
Not yet. There's still some things in the pipeline that we haven't had a specific release date for, but maybe we'll have something coming up soon.
Okay. Yeah, well, pleasure talking to you, and
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Danny.
All right, well, talk to you hopefully later.
Absolutely.